93 days remained before the first true snow would seal the high country of Wyoming, though he did not yet know to count them that way. He only knew the wind had teeth up here, and that his boots had worn thin enough to feel every stone through the soles. He crested the ridge with the last of the afternoon light behind him, breath fogging, pack straps biting into shoulders that had carried it for 300 miles since the group home in Cheyenne had told him he was too old to stay. Below him the land dropped away into a wide bowl of fog, and out of that fog rose something that made him stop walking entirely. Water. A reservoir vast enough that its far shore dissolved into gray mist, held back by a great gray wall of concrete that seemed to have grown out of the mountain itself. And above the dam, perched on a shoulder of rock like something forgotten by whoever built it, stood a squat control house, windows dark, roofline sagging, a rust-streaked antenna leaning at a wrong angle against the sky. He had seen a lot of nothing in his life. Empty lots, boarded windows, towns that had given up on themselves one storefront at a time. But he had never seen a nothing this large, this deliberate, this quiet. The reservoir did not look abandoned so much as waiting. A truck passed on the county road below, radio bleeding out through a half-open window, and he caught pieces of the forecast before the engine noise swallowed it. A low-pressure system building over the divide, rain expected by mid-week, several days of it, maybe more. The announcer's voice flat with the particular boredom of a man reading about weather he didn't have to live through. Noah Mercer did not have a place to live through it either. He shifted his pack and studied the control house a while longer, the way he studied most things now, for what was broken, what could be fixed, what might be worth the risk of trespass. A no trespassing sign hung from a chain-link gate at the base of the access road, its paint sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Nobody had touched that chain in a long time. Grass grew tall and undisturbed along the gravel, and no tire tracks marked the mud. He thought of the shelter in Redstone, 6 more miles down the grade, its cots and its curfew and its $10 a week fee he didn't have. He thought of the coming rain, and of roofs, real roofs, the kind that kept water out rather than the kind he'd been sleeping under, highway overpasses, empty boxcars, the lee side of grain silos. The fog shifted over the reservoir, and for a moment the dam's face showed clean in a shaft of dying light, immense and silent and utterly alone. He started down the ridge toward it, telling himself he only meant to look. The chain-link gate gave without a fight, the padlock's hasp so rusted through that a firm twist of his hand snapped it clean apart. He counted that as its own kind of answer. 31 days until the first snow usually came to these hills, by his reckoning, and he had learned to count things now, days, dollars, miles, because counting was the only ledger he had left to keep. The access road climbed in switchbacks through sage and stunted pine, and the control house grew larger with each turn, its concrete walls streaked gray and green, where decades of runoff had etched their patient trails downward. Up close, the building had the specific stillness of a place time had simply stopped bothering with. A door on the east side hung slightly ajar on a bent hinge, swollen with old rain and dry rot. He put his shoulder to it, once, twice, and on the third try it groaned open into a darkness that smelled of dust, cold metal, and mouse droppings. He stepped inside and let his eyes adjust. A front office greeted him first. A metal desk overturned on its side, drawers hanging open and empty, a calendar still nailed to the wall with a curling page frozen on a month from some year he couldn't guess. Papers had gone soft and yellow on the floor, fused together by old moisture into something like plaster. A coat rack stood in the corner, one wire hanger still swaying faintly from the draft of the open door, as if someone had only just walked out. Beyond the office, a hallway led him past 2 more rooms, a break room with a rusted hot plate and a shattered coffee mug, a supply closet stacked with cardboard boxes that disintegrated at a touch, before opening into the control room itself. He stopped in the doorway and simply looked. The gauges ran floor to ceiling along the far wall, dozens of them, dials with needles frozen at whatever reading had been true the day the county stopped caring. Dust lay thick over the glass faces, gray as ash, undisturbed by hand or breath in what he guessed had to be 20, maybe 30 years. A bank of switches sat beneath the gauges, their toggles caked in grime, and above them a long panel of hand-lettered labels: intake, sluice, reserve level. The paint faded but legible if he tilted his head into what little light came through the grimy windows. No hum of electricity, no blinking light. No sound at all but wind finding some gap in the roof line and the small creak of settling concrete far below his feet, like the building breathing once, slowly, in its sleep. He ran a finger across one gauge and left a clean line through the dust, and something in that small act settled a fact into him plainly. Nobody was watching this place. Nobody had been for a very long time. He turned toward a narrow corridor leading deeper into the structure, toward a set of stairs he could just make out descending into darkness, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something close to purpose. The light was failing by the time he pulled himself back up from the corridor, deciding the stairs into the dam's belly could wait for morning, when he'd have more than the gray hour before dusk to see where he stepped. 20, 30 years of dark down there. It would keep one more night. He climbed instead toward the upper floor, where a short hallway opened onto 3 small rooms, a filing office gutted to its bones, a closet stacked with rotted uniforms, and at the end, facing west toward the water, a room barely bigger than a boxcar, with one tall window and a rusted iron stove squatting in the corner like an old dog waiting to be fed. The window's lower pane was shattered, its edges gone soft and round with weather, and a drift of dead leaves had blown in and settled against the baseboard, brittle as paper. He stood in the doorway a moment, letting the last daylight pour through the broken glass and lay itself gold across the floorboards, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't known was tight. There was work to do before dark took the choice away from him. He found a scrap of tin flashing, curling off the roof edge outside, pried it free with the flat of his pocket knife, and bent it flat against the porch rail until it lay close enough to shape. Back inside, he fitted it into the broken pane, hammering the edges down with the heel of his boot where they wouldn't sit flush, then packed the gaps with a length of canvas torn from the bottom of his backpack's rain flap, wedging it tight with a splintered stick until the wind stopped finding its way through. It wasn't much. It wouldn't hold against real weather, not the kind that came down off these hills in November, but it would hold against tonight, and tonight was the only night that mattered right now. He swept the leaves out with his forearm, dragged in what dry brush and broken shelving he could find for the stove, and by the time full dark settled over the reservoir, he had a small fire ticking behind the rusted grate, smoke drawing up through a flue that groaned in protest before it remembered its old job. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, watching orange light flicker against boards that hadn't held warmth in decades, and ate the last of the bread from his pack, slowly, making it last. Outside, the water lay black and still under a sky gone the color of a bruise, and somewhere far below, a night bird called once and went quiet. He thought about the stairs he hadn't taken yet, the dark corridor waiting below the gauges, the smell of oil and dust, that clung to the whole structure like a memory nobody had bothered to file away. Tomorrow, he told himself, watching the fire settle into embers. Tomorrow he'd go down. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of light that made no promises. He woke stiff against the wall, the fire long dead, and counted what remained of his days before he let himself think about anything else. 9 days of food if he stretched it. Fewer than that if the weather turned mean and he had to spend calories fighting the cold instead of exploring. He allotted himself the week anyway. A week to learn the place before he decided whether it could hold him or whether he'd have to walk on before the snow came down off the peaks and closed the roads for good. He started with the catwalks, moving along the exterior grating with a hand always on the rail, testing each panel with his boot before trusting it his weight. Some of the metal had rusted through to lace, and he marked those spots in his head like a man memorizing a minefield. The structure ran longer than he'd first guessed, wrapping around the face of the control house and out toward the dam's crest, offering him glimpses of the reservoir from angles that made the water look even larger, even more patient than it had from the road. Inside, he worked corridor by corridor with a flashlight scavenged from a drawer in the front office, its batteries weak but serviceable. The maintenance passages ran narrower than the offices above, walled in cinder block and threaded with pipe conduit gone orange with rust. He found a boiler room, empty of its boiler. A supply closet with rotted coveralls still hanging on a hook, as if the man who wore them had simply stepped out for a smoke and never come back. He found a bathroom with a mirror gone black at the edges, and he looked at himself in it for a moment longer than he meant to, surprised by how tired he looked, how the last month on the road had worn down his face like water-working stone. It was on the third day, following a corridor that dead-ended where he expected it to open, that he found the stairwell. It sat behind a door he'd taken at first for another closet, hidden in a recess of the hallway where the light barely reached. But the door had a different weight to it when he pushed, heavier, hinged on iron rather than the flimsy hardware used everywhere else. Beyond it, concrete steps dropped away into darkness, steep and narrow, curving out of sight after the first dozen risers. Cool air rose up to meet him, carrying that same oil and dust smell that clung to the whole building, but stronger here, older, like it had been sealed up and left to concentrate for 30 years. A length of chain looped through the stair rail and the door handle, rusted to the color of dried blood, held by a padlock so corroded he doubted the key existed anymore that could turn it. He crouched and studied the lock in the flashlight's dying beam, turning it over once in his fingers, already thinking about which tools in his pack might be equal to it. 9 days left, though he didn't know it yet. He only knew the lock, and the lock did not want to be known. He worked it the way he worked everything, slow, patient, listening for the small mechanical truths hidden inside rust. A thin file first, to scrape corrosion from the keyway, then a bent wire, walked in with the careful attention of a man threading a needle by lamplight. The padlock resisted for the better part of an hour, and twice he stopped, flexed his fingers, told himself that a door that had waited 3 decades could wait 1 more day. But something in the cool air rising off those stairs kept pulling him back, some old instinct that recognized purpose folded into stone. When the shackle finally gave, it came with a small metallic sigh, as if the lock itself had been holding its breath. The chain fell away. He looped it aside, eased the door open on hinges that groaned but held, and started down. The stairwell dropped steeper than he expected, the concrete worn smooth in the center of each step by feet that had climbed it thousands of times, decades ago. His flashlight beam skated along water-stained walls, past pipe conduits long since dry, past a rusted handrail he gripped more from habit than need. At the bottom, the passage opened into a narrow room, no larger than a tool shed, lined with metal shelving gone soft and orange with age. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. Journals. A dozen or more, cloth-bound and swollen with old moisture, stacked with a neatness that suggested someone had meant to come back for them. Beside them, rolled blueprints tied with twine that crumbled at his touch, the paper beneath still holding its ink, faint blue lines describing gears and gates and pressures he didn't yet understand. He set the flashlight on the shelf, angled toward the ceiling to spread its light, and opened the topmost journal with the same care he gave to old engines that might still turn if handled gently enough. The handwriting inside was small, deliberate, engineer's hand, dates from the late 50s, notes on flow rates, gate tolerances, water pressure calculations, scrawled beside sketches of machinery he hadn't yet found. Somewhere in these pages, a man had spent years thinking about water the way Noah thought about broken hinges, as something that could be understood, respected, and made to behave. Near the back of the journal, tucked between two pages, he found a folded scrap of paper different from the rest, hand-drawn, hurried, marked with arrows and a single circled phrase he had to angle toward the light to read. Lower turbine chamber, sealed 1961. Access below spillway housing. He sat back on his heels, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through his jeans, and looked at that small circled note as though it might rearrange itself into something less significant than it felt. Somewhere beneath him, sealed away for over 30 years, there was more. 6 days remained before he let himself go looking for the chamber the note had promised. He told himself it was patience, not fear, that made him wait. That a man didn't tear into a locked room beneath a dam without first knowing what might come loose above him. So he counted the days differently, not toward the discovery, but away from the cold that had settled into the upstairs room like something with its own claim on the place. The roof went first. He worked mornings when the light was flat and even, prying up curled shingles gone brittle as old bread, finding the rot beneath where water had been finding its way in, for who knew how many winters. He replaced what he could with salvaged tin from a collapsed equipment shed a half-mile down the access road, hammering seams flat, learning the roof's slope by the ache in his shoulders. By the 4th day, the ceiling above his cot had stopped weeping when it rained, and he lay listening to water hit metal instead of watching it drip onto floorboards, and something in his chest loosened that he hadn't known was tight. The stove took longer. He'd found it shoved into a corner of the office wing, its flue collapsed, its door hanging on one hinge, but the iron itself was sound, and iron that was sound could always be made to work again. He scavenged stovepipe from the maintenance shed, packed gaps with clay he dug from the reservoir's margin and dried by the window, and on the 5th evening he lit the first fire the room had held in 3 decades. The smoke drew clean. He sat on the floor and watched the flames through the cracked door glass, and felt, for the first time since he'd walked into the county, something that resembled staying still. Between the labor he kept reading. The journals didn't give up their meaning easily. They were a working man's notes, not a story meant for anyone else's eyes, but patterns emerged the way patterns always did when he paid attention long enough. The engineer had not simply logged numbers. He had worried. Pages of pressure calculations gave way to pages about the valley below, about what a certain volume of water moving at a certain speed would do to a town built where a town probably shouldn't have been built. They will forget this place. One entry read, dated only months before the county records showed the funding cut. But the water will not forget the valley. Noah closed the journal each night with the same unease, set it beside the cot where the firelight could still reach it, and lay listening to the wind move across the reservoir's black surface far below the window. The room was becoming a home. He could feel it happening in his hands, in the calluses forming new shapes, in the way he'd started calling the stove. His stove without meaning to. But the folded map stayed tucked against his ribs some nights, and he kept thinking of that circled phrase, and of a man dead 30 years who had never stopped worrying about water he could no longer control. 10 days remained, though he did not know it yet. The storm was still a rumor in the wind's shifting quarter, still a pressure he could feel only in his knees and the ache behind his eyes. What he knew was the chain. It hung across the stairwell like something the building had grown rather than something bolted there, thick with the same rust that colored everything else in the place, its padlock fused shut by 3 decades of damp. He'd walked past it a dozen times carrying water, carrying tools, telling himself it wasn't his business. But the map had a line drawn through the lower level, a small square marked with initials that matched none of the ones on the office doors upstairs, and the unease he'd been carrying since the journal entries had settled into something more like obligation. He worked the chain loose with a bolt cutter, borrowed patience, and a length of pipe for leverage, and when the last link gave, the sound echoed down into the dark below, like something releasing a breath it had held since before he was born. The stairwell descended further than the window light could follow, so he went by lantern, counting steps out of habit, feeling the temperature drop degree by degree, the way it did in cellars and mine shafts and other places the sun forgot. The air changed too, mineral and cold, threaded with the smell of old oil and standing water. At the bottom, a corridor. At the end of the corridor, a door with the same initials from the map, and behind it, when he finally forced the hinges, a room the engineer had built for himself alone. The lantern light found tools first, wrenches and gauges racked in perfect rows, untouched, wrapped in cloth gone stiff with age but still recognizable, still usable. Beyond them, 2 generators squatted like patient animals, their casings dulled but their bones sound. And along the far wall, a bank of levers and wheels connected to pipe and cable that vanished into the concrete itself. A system built parallel to everything upstairs, a second set of hands the dam had never known it had. Noah moved through it slowly, the way he moved through everything that mattered, running his palm along cold metal, testing what turned and what didn't, reading the engineer's handwriting stenciled beneath each control in paint gone thin as breath. Most of it answered to his touch with only stiffness, the reluctance of long sleep. But one wheel, when he leaned his whole weight against it, gave a groan and turned a 1/4 inch, and somewhere deep in the dam's body, something answered. A shift, a settling, water remembering a path it hadn't used in decades. He stood there a long moment in the lantern light, hand still on the wheel, understanding for the first time exactly what kind of promise he had inherited. 29 days until the rain would come, though he had no way of counting that yet. He only knew the wheel had turned, and that the turning meant something, and that meaning was a thing worth chasing down to its root. He carried 3 of the journals back up to the small room he had made his own, the one with the mended roof and the window that finally sealed against the wind, and he built up the stove until the light inside pushed back hard against the dark outside. Then he sat at the table he'd fashioned from a salvage door and began to read in earnest, The way a man reads when he suspects the words in front of him matter more than he first believed. The handwriting was careful, an engineer's hand, small and upright, the kind that measured twice before it committed ink to page. The early entries were dry. Pressure readings, concrete cure times, complaints about contractors who cut corners on rebar. But as the pages turned, a different thread emerged, one the man had clearly kept close, writing it in margins and then in whole separate sections, as if the thought had grown too large to stay contained. The primary spillway will not answer fast enough in a 100-year event. One entry read, "I have proposed the auxiliary system 3 times, denied 3 times. They see cost. I see the valley." Noah read that line twice, then a third time, feeling something cold settle behind his ribs. He turned pages faster now, chasing the thread through months, then years. The engineer had built the backup system anyway, quietly, on his own time, using salvage and favors, a second nervous system laced through the dam's concrete bones, so that if the day ever came when the main gates failed or lagged, there would be another hand ready to answer. And then, near the back of the third journal, the entries went thin. Budget cuts, the man wrote, in 1962. Staff halved, then halved again. They have decided the dam is not worth defending. They have decided the town below is someone else's problem now. The final entry was dated 1964, only a handful of lines, the ink paler than the rest, as if the man had known he was writing something meant to outlast him. If anyone finds this system and understands it, know that it was built for the town, not the dam. The dam can fail and be forgotten. The town cannot. Noah sat with that for a long time, the stove ticking as it cooled, the wind pressing at the window he'd sealed with his own 2 hands. Somewhere below him, in the dark concrete throat of the structure, a wheel he'd turned only that afternoon was still remembering how to work. He thought of the valley beyond the ridge, the lights of Redstone he'd glimpsed once from the road, sleeping easy in the shadow of a promise nobody living knew had been kept. He closed the journal, but he did not sleep. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm he had built with his own hands, split wood stacked in tidy rows, the stove drawing clean, the window holding fast against the wind that came harder now as autumn deepened toward something colder. He told himself the work was done, or done enough, but he kept climbing down to the turbine chamber anyway, kept oiling the same fittings, kept reading the same pale ink, until the words felt less like a stranger's and more like an instruction meant only for him. Then the sky changed. It came first as a smell, wet iron on the wind, and then as a color, the ridgeline gone the flat gray of an old nickel. By the second day, the rain was no longer weather, but a presence, hammering the tin roof of the control house in a sound like distant gunfire that never let up, never paused to let a man think. He plugged the last gap in the window seal with a rag soaked in tar and watched water sheet down the glass in ropes. On the third day he went out into it anyway, oilskin coat crackling stiff with cold, and made his way along the catwalk to the dam wall where, weeks earlier, he'd found the old gauge mark, a shallow notch cut into the concrete by a hand that had known exactly how much margin the structure had before it stopped being safe. He'd deepened the mark himself with a chisel, made it easier to read at a glance, never thinking he would need it so soon. The water had climbed past the third line. He stood there a long moment, rain running off his hat brim in a steady curtain, and did the arithmetic he'd been avoiding since the storm began. 2 days of this, and the reservoir would touch the 4th mark, 2 more after that, if the rain kept up, and there would be no 4th mark left to read, only water finding its own way over the top of everything a dead man had spent his life trying to hold back. He thought of the county office in town, of Grady's warnings, of the paperwork nobody had filed, and the budget nobody had renewed in 30 years. No truck would come grinding up that washed-out road to check a gauge nobody official even knew existed. No one was coming. There was no one left whose job this was but him. He went back inside, stripped off the dripping coat, and sat by the stove with the 3rd journal open on his knee, reading the old man's instructions again, slower this time, the way a man reads something he intends to actually use. The stove ticked and settled as he read, tracing a finger under lines of faded ink until the words stopped being a dead man's handwriting and became a plan. 3 valves, a wheel gear buried under decades of grease, a spillway gate that hadn't moved since Eisenhower was president. He closed the journal, pulled on his boots again, and lit the lantern he'd rigged from a coffee can and a stub of candle, because the flashlight batteries were already half spent, and there was no telling how many nights like this one still lay ahead. The maintenance corridor swallowed the lantern light whole. He counted his steps out of old habit, the way a man counts anything he can control when everything else has slipped loose. At the first valve he knelt in standing water and worked oil into the seized threads a drop at a time, patient as a man coaxing a stubborn animal, because forcing it would only shear the handle clean off and leave him with nothing. 20 minutes for a quarter turn, another 20 for the next. His hands went numb, and he flexed them by the lantern and kept going. The second valve was worse, packed with rust that flaked like old paint, and he had to strip it down by feel, laying each washer and pin on a rag so he wouldn't lose a single piece in the dark water pooling around his knees. Somewhere above him the rain kept its steady drumming on the roof of the dam, a sound he'd stopped hearing hours ago the way a man stops hearing his own heartbeat, until he made himself listen again and understood, with the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning, that the sound had not once let up. By the time he reached the gate mechanism itself, gray light was starting to bleed in through the high vents, though whether it was true dawn or just the storm thinning enough to let a little through, he couldn't say. He set his shoulder to the wheel and threw his whole weight against it. Nothing. He backed off, oiled the collar again, waited the longest 5 minutes of his life, and tried once more. This time it gave, a groan that seemed to come up through the floor and into his boots, half an inch, then an inch, then a slow grinding turn that told him the old system, forgotten as it was, still remembered how to work. He didn't celebrate. There wasn't time for that. He wiped his hands on his coat, checked the pressure gauge by lantern light, and made a note in the margin of the journal in his own handwriting beside the dead engineer's, because somebody after him might need to know exactly how long each valve had taken, and how close they'd come to running out of time before they'd even started. The gate held its new angle, and the water began to move where before it had only pressed and waited, a low churn deepening into a steady roar somewhere below the catwalk, funneled through the backup spillway the dead engineer had cut into the rock decades before anyone thought to worry about the valley below. He climbed back up through the maintenance corridor with his lantern swinging, counting the rungs out of habit more than need, and stepped out onto the platform above the reservoir to see the gray dawn fully now, rain still coming but thinner, the sky the color of wet ash. He walked to the dam wall and found the carved gauge mark by feel almost as much as sight, and the water had crept to within inches of the highest line he'd scored into the concrete 2 nights before. He watched it for a long moment, willing it to hold, and then he saw the smallest hesitation in its climb, a slowing, the kind of thing a man notices only if he has spent 3 days doing nothing else but watch. He didn't trust it yet. He went back to the wheel and opened the gate another quarter turn, listening to the pitch of the water change beneath him, then made himself walk away before he could be tempted to force it further and undo everything by trying too hard for too much. In the office upstairs, water dripping steadily from his coat onto floorboards he had sanded himself, he pulled the CB radio out from under the desk, where he'd rigged the antenna wire up through the broken window weeks earlier, more out of loneliness than plan. He turned the dial with fingers gone stiff and slow from cold, found the channel the county trucks used, the one he'd heard chatter on before during smaller storms, and pressed the switch. His voice came out rougher than he expected. He gave the dam's name, gave his own, said the reservoir was at its gauge line and the backup spillway was open and holding, said Redstone should expect rising water downstream through the morning, but nothing sudden, nothing without warning, if the gate kept doing what it was doing. He said it twice, plain and slow, the way the engineer's journals had taught him to write things down so a stranger years later could understand them without him there to explain. Static answered him first, long enough that he thought no one was listening at all, and then a voice broke through, tinny and startled, asking him to repeat his location, asking who in the hell was calling in from the old dam station. He looked out the window at the gray water below the gauge line, still climbing, but slower now, and answered that question as best he could. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, though he did not notice at first, too tired to register anything but the steady work of watching the gauge line and the gate lever and the radio, which crackled now and then with voices asking if the water had crested, if he needed anything, if he was going to stay put until they got a truck up the access road. He said he would stay. He had nowhere else to be and everywhere else to leave behind. They came up around mid-morning, 2 county trucks and a sheriff's car, tires spitting mud on the switchback road that hadn't seen traffic in 30 years. He watched them climb out and stand a moment looking at the control house the way people look at something they expected to be a ruin and found instead standing whole, the patched roof, the swept walkway, the window glass catching the thin new light. He came down to meet them with his hands raw and his eyes red-rimmed, expecting questions about trespassing, about who gave him the right. Instead, the man in front, older, with a county seal on his jacket, walked past him first to the gauge mark on the dam wall, studied the carved lines and the water line sitting just below the top of them, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked to see the spillway gate. Noah led him down the stairwell, past the corridors he'd cleared of 40 years of dust, into the turbine chamber where the old generators sat oiled and the manual regulation system stood open, still holding its position exactly where he'd set it the night before. The questions came slower after that, and different than he'd expected. Not about permission, but about how he'd learned the mechanism, how long he'd been living there, whether he understood what he'd actually done. He answered plainly, the way the journals had taught him, showing them the engineer's blueprints. The notes on the backup system nobody alive had known still worked. One of the men said the town had been asleep when the warning came through, that if the water had crested without notice, half of Redstone's low ground would have been underwater by breakfast. They stood together on the catwalk afterward, looking out over the reservoir, calm now under a clean sky, and the county man asked him, almost offhand, if he had somewhere else he needed to be. Noah thought of the roads behind him, the towns he'd drifted through, the doors that had never quite opened. He said no. The man nodded, said the county could use someone who understood the place better than any engineer they could hire from outside, said the job came with a salary and the small apartment upstairs, if he wanted it. Noah looked at the room he'd already made his own, the stove, the window, the water below, and said he did.